Recording in progress.
Good evening, all. I am going to call to order the Tuesday, February 11th, 2025 meeting of the Policy and Services Committee. Madam Clerk, would you kindly call the roll?
Councilmember Liu?
Present.
Councilmember Stone?
Yes, here.
Chair Vinker? All present.
Thank you. Do we have any public comment tonight on matters not on the agenda?
We currently have 2 requests to speak.
Okay, very well. Welcome.
I'd like to begin with a question for you all and then take it from there. The question is, to sustain vital city services, such as improving and maintaining neighborhood parks, open space, providing safe routes to schools, expanding community recreational, youth, senior programs, mental health programs, addressing crime, public safety, improving bike, pedestrian safety, and to help fight diabetes, heart disease, and childhood obesity, shall the city of Palo Alto measure levying a 2 cents per ounce tax for general governmental use on the wholesale distribution of sugar-sweetened beverages, that is sodas, energy drinks, generating $1.5 million annually until ended by voters be adopted. This was Measure Z this past November, passed by the city of Santa Cruz, and similar ballot measures have been approved by Berkeley, Albany, Oakland, San Francisco, Seattle, Washington, Boulder, Colorado, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A yes vote means to add to the city's municipal code a tax as detailed in the full text of the measure. A no vote is to keep the municipal code as such. A soda tax is not new to Palo Alto City Council, and I've asked the clerk to send you the minutes from 2018 when we first brought this up to the City Council. It was supposed to go to the Policy and Services Committee at that time, but just ran out of time. There was another tax measure at that time, went on the ballot, and there was not enough time. In addition, I asked the clerk to send you the executive order from the governor, who also is proposing similar kind of measure for the state. But we're a charter city, so we can do our own taxes. We don't have to wait for this for the state. And finally, I don't know, I have not much time left, but if I ask the clerk to bring up some of the ways that these other cities have funded these grants, and this is the city of San Francisco, and you can see that lots and lots of programs have been supported and funded through this tax. So I'm hopeful that you will bring this forward. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Next speaker.
Your next speaker is Jennifer L.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm not used to 3 minutes. I have less than 2 minutes, so that's a lot of real estate. Hello, Chair Vinker and Council Members Stone and Liu. I'm excited about your leadership on this committee this year, and thank you for all you do. For some background, this committee was the original and longtime home for airplane noise because of the intergovernmental affairs nature of the issue. And so I have been both an avid and also casual observer. I'm here these days in part because I'm trying to inform myself about how City Council engages with the public, how issues get on the City Council agenda or the public agenda, it worked very differently, and many things worked very differently before COVID. Per an email I sent to council on January 11th regarding the priority setting process, I'm very interested in the issues discussed at this committee's December 10th meeting, which was packed with really interesting topics, some that are not reflected in the meeting's action minutes. One item that I'm not finding like a next step for is how the topic of how items make the public agenda, the issue of colleagues' memos and so forth will be handled going forward. Ideally, once all this is sorted out, it would be wonderful, and I wonder if you would consider printing a small handbook or a web page for the public about updated rules and protocols to engage effectively with your body. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you. And we look favorably on shorter public comment. Okay, and with that, we will move to our action items. And I'd like to announce an agenda change that we will reverse the order of items 2 and 3. As we understand, there is greater public interest in item 3, and so we want to get to that a little sooner. But we will go ahead with action item number 1, which is Office of the City Auditor presentation of the Grant Management Audit Report.
Good
Ms.
evening.
Murdoch,
Oh,
welcome.
Thank you. Jump the gun. Good evening, committee members. My name is Kate Murdoch, and I serve as the city auditor. The grant management audit was part of the FY24 annual audit plan, and Claire Veazey served as the project manager for this audit and will be presenting the result.
Good evening. My name is Claire Veazey. I served as the project manager for this audit, and I'll be presenting tonight. The objective for this audit is to determine whether the city has adequate internal controls to manage the grant lifecycle efficiently and effectively. Next slide, please. The city receives federal, state, and local grant funding from various agencies to support city projects and programs. Funding is applied for and distributed across multiple city departments, with grant management activities performed largely at the departmental level. Annually, the Administrative Services Department, or ASD, compiles a schedule of expenditures of federal awards, or CFO report, for the purposes of the single audit performed by the external auditor, MGO. To enhance grant management, the city employs an external consultant, Townsend Public Affairs, to provide grant pursuit and management activities. Recently, the city has also hired a grant analyst position to help streamline the grant administration process. For this audit, the Office of the City Auditor obtained grant records from FY22 to 24 and tested a sample of grants to assess grant management activities and internal controls across 10 departments. Additionally, we evaluated the contract with Townsend and its deliverables and identified ways that the grant analyst can further improve the grant administration process. Next slide, please. Our first finding relates to a lack of coordinated oversight of the city's grant management efforts. This resulted in inconsistencies across departments and increases the potential for non-compliance with grant requirements. Our testing of 15 grants across 10 departments showed that a grant application authorization checklist was not completed by management for 11 grants, as required by the policy. This checklist ensures that management has reviewed the grant and the city's financial obligations. We also found that for all samples tested, copies of the acceptance or grant agreement were not provided to all the sponsoring departments listed in the policy. Lastly, the grant policy was last revised in 2004 and doesn't cover policy and procedures for managing grants throughout the entire grant lifecycle, which includes tracking, monitoring, and closing activities. Our recommendation is that the city update the grant policy to outline departmental management of grant activities, including tracking, monitoring, and closing. This will provide a comprehensive view of the grant lifecycle and align departmental activities. Additionally, we recommend that the city ensure all departments receive training on the updated policy and determine if it applies to all to all grants, or only those actively applied for by the city. Lastly, we recommend that the city utilize the grant analyst position for coordinated oversight of grant administration from application to closure. ASD agreed with our recommendations. Our second finding is that the city lacks sufficient record keeping and internal reporting, leading to limited monitoring and visibility of grant performance. We found that there is not a complete central repository of all active city grants. While ASD compiles an annual listing of grants, only federal grants are validated for completeness and accuracy for the single audit. Our analysis of 15 grants showed that 8 did not have formalized internal tracking and reporting, such as project plans and timelines. Additionally, 4 grants did not provide performance reports within the required time frame of the grant agreement. However, there were no penalties for reports submitted after the deadline for these grants. Grant milestones, such as when a grant is awarded or closed out, are not formally communicated by the departments to ASD. This limits visibility of active grants in the city. And finally, the city has not formally tracked which grants have been applied for versus awarded, limiting visibility of its performance pursuing and winning grants. We recommend that the city consider establishing a central repository for all grants, detailing the number of active grants, their sources, whether federal, state, or local, and dollar amounts. The city should consider setting up central or separate accounts or cost centers for each grant in the financial system, which is SAP, for easier tracking. For non-recurring grants, we recommend that the city track and monitor milestones and notify relevant departments upon award or closure to improve record keeping. Finally, the city should consider utilizing the grant analyst position to enhance tracking and reporting, thus helping the city gauge trends and review grant applications versus awards. Again, ASD agreed with our recommendations. Lastly, we found that the city does not consistently assess and track efforts in pursuing and managing grant opportunities to measure its return on investment. The city does not assess whether to pursue potential grant opportunities based on the effort, time, and complexity that may be required in application and administration of the grant. Additionally, while Townsend Public Affairs, the city's external grant consultant, appears to have provided some valuable services to the city, they have not provided some of the deliverables specified in the contract. This may make it difficult for the city to assess its performance. The grant analyst indicated that they'll be working with Townsend to clarify deliverables and incorporate a strategic funding plan with a grant dashboard to improve reporting and tracking of grants. We recommend that the city consider establishing a system to assess grant pursuit, application, and administration efforts, determining when to pursue or abandon such opportunities. The city should determine if tracking staff time spent pursuing and managing grants would be beneficial. Establishing a process for assessing efforts would aid in the overall evaluation of the grant program performance and its return on investment. Finally, we recommend that the city continue to explore and implement strategies to make the most effective use and reporting of the external contract for grant application, tracking, and monitoring services. ASD also agreed with these recommendations. This concludes our presentation, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Veazey. Let's see if there's any questions up here, and then we'll go to public comment. So colleagues, any questions?
Questions or just technical questions?
Any questions at this, be a little less formal? Councilmember Liu.
Can you share some bigger picture context about the risks of the record keeping and grant tracking issues that we have so far? Were any of the grants we analyzed, did they potentially include punitive measures if we didn't fulfill some obligations? Did we actually miss any obligations? Is there any more context around that?
Yes, so we did test whether grants did not meet certain deadlines for reporting and noted that there were no financial penalties for these. We also checked grants that were out of our samples tested, grants that were closed out to see if any funding was left on the table and did not find any instances of that. So we saw that all grant awards were expended. So I think, you know, on the high risk level, we didn't see any instances of any high risks.
Okay. One question about finding two in the set of recommendations there. There's discussion about tracking separate accounts or cost centers. Can you talk about how we track that right now and how we currently reconcile the budget for the grant money that we do spend?
I think that might be a great question for management to answer. I know that they've been making some changes.
Hello, good evening, Christine Pross, Assistant Director of Administrative Services. Right now, it depends. If it's a capital project, we'll usually track the grant funding within that capital project. Generally, we'll include grant revenue in a category called from what other agencies under and file it under federal, state, or local grants.
Okay, thank you. So it sounds like that there is some separate tracking already with, at least for budgeting purposes. So I'm not, yeah, that's fine. Okay, those are my questions for now. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for the report. As always, our audits are really thorough and nice to be able to kind of examine our own internal processes and see where we can improve. So my only question for staff, if I understand that it seems like a lot of these, if not all of these recommendations have kind of been accepted or agreed upon. So what is the process moving forward? Are they all being currently kind of implemented? I mean, I know item 3 tonight this tees up item 3 really well, and we're going to be kind of talking about some of that, but some of the other more kind of internal, more administrative controls, what's the next step?
Next step, definitely for administrative services, we hired our grant analyst who is going to be working through a lot of these recommendations. Quite frankly, some of them will be great improvements to our processes, especially with the incoming tracking of opportunities. So we're really focused on that. And so within the next several months, we're hoping to update the policy to include a full picture of the grant life cycle and things that the guidance for departments on how they could better track, manage with our oversight.
Great. Thank you. And all the recommendations made a lot of sense to me. So I can't remember if this eventually requires a motion.
Yes. And I wanted to jump in really quickly if I can. Chair Vinker. Ms. Paras and her team are really looking forward to taking these recommendations to continue to build our grants program. So the city has not had as robust of a grants program historically in terms of receiving larger dollars or larger numbers of federal or state grants. And so some of the things that you're seeing from Ms. Paras with the agreement, understanding that these are great recommendations for what a robust grant management program will look like. And we're excited to really put them in place as we continue to grow our program. So I think it's just important to keep in mind, we're still sort of in an infancy state in that regard for a larger volume and dollar amount.
Thank you, Assistant City Manager, or Deputy. I was actually intended to ask you if you wanted to, I noticed in the staff report that there was a staff sort of context setting memo that talked about how pre-pandemic there weren't a lot of grant dollars flowing into the city and that now there are a lot more. And I had meant to offer you the opportunity to give that context. And I think, and I did note, as did Councilmember Stone, that all three of the findings that the recommendations were agreed with. But I was curious about a little more granularity on the third one, which is about a more formal work plan being under development. Because I note in the staff response, it talks about the meetings with Townsend and more formal work plan with them being under development. But I guess what I'm intrigued about is not having formally tracked the grants that we've applied for versus been awarded. So it's one thing to track them once we get them and how we're doing against milestones and all of that. But it would be a really interesting learning opportunity to know what did we do well in the application process? What makes the city attractive as a grantee and all of that? So I don't know if you have any comment about that piece in particular.
Thank you. We are working with Townsend Public Affairs for all of our advocacy work, as you recall, for state, federal, and grants management. And so we use the sort of intermingled nature of that for being able to follow up with some of the agencies that we have those built relationships with when we do apply for grants and we don't receive them. So there are a few. The one that I can think of this year, just because I was close to it, is the Encampment Resolution Fund grant that we applied for. It was a stretch for us in terms of whether we would get it or not, but we were able to utilize Townsend to follow up with specific people at that agency just to find out ways we can be more competitive if we were to apply for such funds in the future. So the monthly meetings that we have with Townsend, they're usually speaking about the opportunities that are forthcoming and maybe our competitive nature that we can have. And I think Ms. Paras is looking forward, and Mr. Haggerty, who's online, is looking forward to having that better tracking system for knowing the ones that we've applied for and hit or didn't hit so that we can use that feedback for future grants. And Michael, I don't know if you want to just say hello since you're online.
Well, in fact, let's use that as an opportunity to introduce Michael Haggerty, who is our new grants manager and grants
Welcome.
management analyst. I want to make that, get that straight. So Michael, would you like to say hello?
Yes, hello, members of the City Council. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to working with you on this audit and implementing the recommendations.
Excellent. Well, welcome. We are looking forward to having you do that. So that's terrific. I think it's almost a twofold approach here. We want to know how best to get them in the door and then how best to utilize them once they're in the door so that we get more. But it does seem like there is, especially given that we weren't robustly pursuing this perhaps before the pandemic, that this is an opportunity to augment and supplement our budget on specific items. So I'm glad to see this come before us, and I'm glad to see the interest in pursuing it. I had one other question where I'm just not quite tracking the meaning on the slide with respect to the recommendation for finding one, coordinated oversight. The middle sentence says, ensure all departments receive training on the updated policy. Okay, I can track that. And determine if it applies to all grants or only those actively applied for by the city. what other grants would our policy apply to? I'm just not tracking what that means.
So I can take a stab at it and staff may want to weigh in. There are certain grants that the city receives that they don't have to apply for, that are just kind of pass-through grants that they receive from the state. But staff may want to elaborate on that.
I see. And is the question whether or not those would also need the tracking and monitoring?
Correct.
Well,
And why wouldn't they necessarily be handled the same way?
My understanding is that they don't require the same level of reporting as grants that are applied for. But I'll pass that over to staff.
Do you want to take a try at that, Mike?
I don't quite understand the question. Could you just?
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand why our policy would be different for these grants that we don't apply for, but nevertheless receive, why we wouldn't track or monitor them. I mean, obviously, you know, the policy could say it in compliance with whatever the requirements of the grant are, but I'm just trying to figure out why our grant policy wouldn't apply to all of our grants. So that's how
I think this is speaking to the requirement to list federal grant expenditures specifically as a more specific requirement, but it is generally a good principle to track all grant agreements that the city is associated with, even ones that the city may be offering in-kind services for. Does that help?
Yeah, I think what I'm gleaning from this is that maybe one of your early tasks is to figure out how broad our grant policy should be and if it applies to all of those grants. I'm getting some nods.
Chair Vinker, I think you're right that we should do an overall look at when receiving a grant of, tracking of grants in the overall. And also some grants can be looked at on a case-by-case basis. Some of the things stipulated in our policy may not even apply to such grant requirements. So I think that is part of our role too, in reviewing grant requirements against the policy. And if the square peg doesn't fit in the round hole, then we'll definitely alter our approach and document it with an ESD.
All right, thank you. Let's see if there's any public comment. Madam Clerk?
We do not have requests to speak on this item.
Okay. Do you have additional questions from my colleagues? No. Okay, then do we need a motion to accept the audit? And getting a yes, do I have a motion?
I believe it's a recommendation that council.
Do I have a motion to recommend that council accepts the audit?
So moved.
Second.
Very well. Would you call the vote?
Councilmember Stone,
Yes.
Councilmember Liu,
Yes.
Chair Vinker.
Yes,
Motion carries.
terrific.
If I might, just as since this is the first time, this committee with this composition is approving or reviewing an audit. Based on the unanimous recommendation from the committee, this will appear on the full city council's consent agenda.
Thank you. Okay, and with that, we will, as mentioned earlier, move to item 3, which is our nonprofit partnerships work plan phased approach. So do we have, I guess we have.
Yes,
We have our
reporting for
staff
staff
report.
will be Lupita Alamos, our assistant to the city manager.
Ms. Alamos, welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair and Council. My name is Lupita Alamos, and I'm an assistant to the city manager. And tonight's item is a discussion of the nonprofit partnership work plan phased approach. And I just want to acknowledge that in partnership with me tonight is Vinka Vanderswag, who heads our our Office of Human Services. Next slide. So the recommendation before the committee tonight is to review and recommend City Council approval of a phased approach to enhancing nonprofit partnerships, beginning with the process improvements for nonprofit request funding through the fiscal year 26 budget process. And importantly to note is which fall outside of a currently established process. Next slide. Just one thing to note that one of the things we heard in the City Council's nonprofit partnership study session back in October was the need to process and help with nonprofit requests, especially those that were presented through the budget process. So what this work plan tries to achieve is to provide the council with an option to help process such requests. The purpose of the nonprofit work plan, this work was initiated by a recommendation from our 2022 city auditor on nonprofit partnerships. That report pointed to some existing policies and processes for managing relationships that lack consistency, transparency, and accountability on both sides, which results in inefficiencies and unclear expectations, especially on our nonprofit partners. So to address that, we recognize that we need to establish this work plan with a clear framework that aligns nonprofit partnerships with our council priorities, ensuring fairness and inclusion in our resource allocation, strengthening accountability while maintaining the agility to evolving community needs. The totality of our work plan is phased in two phases. In this first phase, as described, would encompass those requests that are not part of an existing grant process. Our second phase of this work plan would focus on subsequent committee discussion and consideration of applying our nonprofit principles that were discussed back in our study session in October, and applying and working through how that would apply to the rest of our grant programs, our service and lease agreements. Noting that the implementation of such work, it will take time. We recognize that this work will begin then in the summer. So just a refresh of our guiding principles that we covered back in October 28th. Our framework that was presented would help guide our nonprofit partnerships or the management of our nonprofit partnerships through the definition of these principles, practices, and products. Our principles here we define as the goals and values that guide establishment in pursuit of nonprofit partnerships. Our practices we defined as the policies and protocols through which our principles are implemented. And finally, our products are the visible methods through which our principles and practices are implemented and communicated. The four identified, or I should say revised principles, include impact-oriented focus and accountability, service alignment, fairness, open access, equity and inclusion, and flexibility for special circumstances. So again, in the second phase of this work plan, the council referred that policy and services define how that work would apply to, again, those grant program service agreements and lease agreements. So the focus for tonight really is to then talk about the phase one of the work plan and the key elements supporting tonight's discussion. Next slide, please. Include funding availability, eligibility and criteria, application and evaluation process and timeframe, and monitoring and reporting. So I'll go through this presentation through those four elements and talk about the different recommendations and best practices within each. For the first one, for funding availability, so in considering the nature of competing needs of our budget dollars each year, staff recommends that our first phase be funded using a portion of the ongoing funding for city events and programming. This was approved in the fiscal year 25 budget and is an ongoing item that allocates $235,000 for that effort. Staff recommends that $185,000 be used for this phase one, and the remaining $50,000 continue to fund community events. Last year, this number, the 185, generally encompassed funding that the council awarded through the budget process to UNAF, Third Thursday, Magical Bridge, and environmental volunteers. So that's how we came up with that 185,000. Eligibility and criteria. When considering best practices for eligibility, and in general, given the short time frame of the development of this phase, we are recommending that in this initial phase, all nonprofit 501c3 organizations be eligible for apply for this program. And perhaps in the next funding cycle, consideration be given to best practice of balancing new and existing organizations, as this is something to consider for, continuing innovative programs and service delivery while balancing the need to consider sustainability of existing grantees. As it relates to criteria, public benefit should be in alignment with our council priorities. This is our staff recommendation to help align those requests. And other best practices to consider under this criteria are community reach, so the number of Palo Altans that would be served, equity impact, so in particular paying attention to our vulnerable population and how those services would benefit them. And the capacity of nonprofits to deliver service program, as well as nonprofit overall budget portfolio. Another recommendation would be to consider, again, balancing the new or existing organization needs, considering service redundancy, ensuring that we're not already granting for those types of services. And is there already an existing process or program that could accommodate that request? And finally, would that funding best be aligned with another jurisdiction such as state or county dollars? As it relates to application and evaluation process, noting that to expedite this, we're recommending that this be considered in the fiscal year 26 budget cycle, and that would cover funding would cover the period of July 1st, 2025 through June 30th, 26. We would recommend that all proposals be evaluated and awarded by our council directly to kind of cut that middleman and have that direct consideration. And one way to streamline this process is to establish thresholds, which we'll cover in the next page, that could scale that evaluation. When considering the time frame of this program, again, we want to recognize that both of these options are very ambitious. We have two options before you tonight to consider. In both options, we include a second policy and services meeting for March 11th, if that is needed to flesh out the details of this program. In option one, the application period affords nonprofits a 39-day application period versus option two, which would afford a 90-day. Another difference to note is the way in which the funding would occur. While both have the council both reviewing and awarding those, in option one, those awards recipients would happen through the budget adoption in June, whereas in option two, that process the funding amount would be approved through the budget process, but then the award to the different recipients would be made at the end of August, again, allowing for a little longer application period. And finally, the last key element to consider is the monitoring and reporting. Again, I'm trying to balance that and scale our reporting requirements. So noting here that small grants would be anything less than 5,000. This would be a very simple process that would possibly be a 1 to 2 page that would summarize key activities, and basic financial impacts would be highlighted. Some of the reporting would be more of a self-certification of compliance with the grant, but could also include any kind of financial reports. For a medium-sized grant, we're looking at anything then above that 5,000 up to 100,000 as it relates to the reporting requirements. Something typical and a best practice would be a semi-annual report, for instance, that would include service outcomes and performance metrics. On the financial side, depending on the risk, we would recommend an independently prepared compilation report, which is a much less costly and involved than audited financials. We would also offer the option of including an IRS Form 990, which most nonprofits are already required to submit. And then for the category are large grants over 100,000. Again, we would require either quarterly or semi-annual service outcomes, performance metrics, or a year-end report. And for the financial, again, looking here at an independently prepared compilation report or review of financial statements by a certified public accountant. Excuse me. So for next steps, we will continue to engage our nonprofits throughout this process via listening sessions, encouraging participation in these meetings, and then incorporating that feedback throughout this process to inform council actions. We plan to do this by sharing this information through the city platforms, as well as dedicating a nonprofit work plan webpage. So with that, staff's recommendation here, and if the committee agrees with this approach, then we have outlined those 4 elements to inform that work. That concludes my presentation.
So with that, let me try to level up a little bit the quick snapshot of what we have to propose to you today. Much of the specifics that Ms. Alamos walked through are illustrative of how we could lay out the details of a path forward. But at the same time, with the bottom line up front, what we're proposing is a first phase on this work plan that fits within the context of the upcoming budget cycle. It's really a contrast to, quite frankly, using last year as an example, where we had a handful of nonprofits providing very specific requests through the budget, but without a consistent structure to evaluate or even for them to submit what they were proposing. So this would be a way to, again, take a first step on this overall work plan by providing more guidance to any nonprofit that does submit a request in the upcoming budget. So if the council is amenable to that approach, we've got tonight as well as next month as an opportunity to nail down any specifics to that and then have the council agree. And then ultimately there is, as was described here, a bit of a handoff or a point at which there will be a handoff to the finance committee to actually run with the evaluation of the any proposals that are received this year. So I hope that as a recap is helpful.
Thank you, City Manager. Yes, and thank you, Ms. Alamos, for your presentation. I do recall last year the process and the desire to have some more structure and predictability and transparency around it, because I was on finance last year. So glad we have this topic teed up tonight and appreciate your proposals. With that, I'd like to move to public comment.
We currently have 1 request to speak. It's from Charlie W.
And good evening, Chair Vinker, council members and staff. Charlie Wydans, Palo Alto Chamber of Commerce. The Palo Alto Chamber represents over 30 of our local nonprofits who receive funding from the city of Palo Alto, and we support the nonprofit partnership work plan process that you're discussing tonight to enhance the engagement and relationship with our nonprofits. We appreciate the work of Lupita and her staff that have put into developing the nonprofit partnership principles to improve engagement, support, funding, and evaluation. We have been involved in each of the stakeholder meetings that staff have organized, and we support the four guiding principles of impact-oriented focus, service alignment, fairness, open access, equity, and inclusion, and flexibility for special circumstances. We support the staff recommendation that Policy and Services Committee recommend an initial phase 1 approach for nonprofits not currently in the established funding process for requests for funding in the FY 2026 budget. This phased approach will not only allow new nonprofits to apply for funding, but also give the council and staff an opportunity to begin engaging with nonprofits in alignment with the new principles that are being presented to you tonight. We are very interested in continued evaluation of the phase 1 outcomes, as this process will directly affect all nonprofits that are currently receiving funds through grants, leases, service contracts, and particularly we look forward to how the elements of funding availability, eligibility, criteria, application and evaluation, monitoring and reporting, and how these are rolled out, because they're going to be utilized for existing nonprofits in phase 2. Thank you.
Thank you.
We did have one more person raise their hand, Dale C.
Dale C., welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dale Calhoun, and I'm the program manager with Palo Alto Downtown Streets team. For those of you who don't know, we work alongside our unhoused and low-income neighbors, making sure they're met with dignity, respect, and the support they need to move forward. We at Downtown Streets team believe in building a community where everyone, no matter their background or circumstances, has the opportunity to rebuild their lives. And right now, with housing insecurity, economic instability, and immigration challenges, more people in our community are struggling just to get by. So thanks to the grants like HISRAP, we've been able to reach more people, welcome our participants into our programs, and help individuals take steps towards self-sufficiency. We agree with the city's phased approach to funding, and this shift with the grants would allow nonprofits to directly target needs across a range of sizes, from small and immediate needs to longer-term solutions in our community. And we're grateful that the city is looking at new ways to partner with nonprofits. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And with that, we'll close public comment. I guess what I think might be helpful to organize this conversation is to first check with my colleagues here to see if they're on board with the 4 nonprofit relationship principles and looking at work plan phase 1, because if so, then we could perhaps step through each of the 4 categories in order. Is that acceptable? Okay, I think Mr.
Organized for that style of discussion, but I can come
Well,
to the last and I'll be ready.
You can, do you want to say something preliminarily about this? You're welcome to.
It's fine.
Okay.
I'll rearrange my thoughts.
Okay.
So I can work with it.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so with that, first you have funding availability, and talked about the basing it on the $235,000 from last year, with the $50,000 for community events and $185,000 allocated through phase 1 funding requests. And I'm wondering if my colleagues have any comment or questions about that approach. Councilmember Stone.
Thank you. I guess for the city events and programming budget, I guess I envisioned that funding was going to be used by the city to be able to expand and diversify our existing list of more city-sponsored events like Third Thursday, the Art Festival, Mayfest, et cetera. I know we hired a new event specialist this year too. I feel like I haven't seen much progress in proposing new events. And that's a bit concerning to me. And it kind of seems like seems like there really isn't much of a plan to be able to do a further investment in kind of more kind of community type of events. It seems this approach, and unless staff is kind of envisioning that would be now a separate kind of line item in the budget. So this just kind of concerns me in that way. I have no issue with the actual approach, but where that money's coming from, and then what that leaves left over for city-sponsored and kind of funded events.
Right. So thank you for the question and clarification or opportunity to clarify. They really are separate, I'll say efforts or at least resources. In terms of the funding that's shown here, we really simply wanted to provide a foundation that would enable this overall approach to have some money to work with. And so the funding that had been designated in last year's budget seems a logical starting place. Ultimately, the council could decide to increase the dollars available for these types of uses or other as may be appropriate based on the overall fiscal situation heading into the upcoming budget. For events specifically, we actually do have a separate item that we're bringing to council, and I think Kristen is here. Yes, Director O'Kane is here to review the plan for city-sponsored, city-produced events that, again, are funded outside of this, the dollars we're speaking to completely. And so if desired by the committee, we could speak to how that is shaping up. But I think it is, to your point, useful to think about the city-produced events that are being run by CSD and will have coming to you separately. There is the $50,000 proposal here, which is really anticipated as an expansion beyond the existing grant program that's the Know Your Neighbors grants that could be used for larger grants. And perhaps that's an area that Director O'Kane can also expand on. And then there's this $185,000 that could also be used for events as well, but is really intended to be available for broader purposes as may be proposed by our nonprofit partners.
Great, thanks.
Sure, and thank you. I'm Kristen O'Kane, Community Services Director. So just building upon what City Manager Shikata said, is oftentimes when we get applications for the Know Your Neighbors grant, they're actually more community-wide events, and they can be really amazing ideas. For example, we had a group who wanted to do an event for Chinese immigrants in Palo Alto, but that was citywide. It wasn't just a block at a time. What's that? It wasn't neighbors. It wasn't neighbors and it wasn't a block. So it didn't qualify for a Know Your Neighbors grant, but it was something we really wanted to fund. So that was a case where council used their contingency to fund that. But this process will allow for us to do that at the staff level within the Community Services Department.
Great, thanks. That makes me feel much better. And I do think this process of the larger Know Your Neighbor grants and kind of a more formal process to do this is far better than kind of our current process. I mean, like several times last year, we had the situation, great community events that community members wanted to organize, and they came to council, and I guess the only real way we were able to do it was through the council contingency fund, and we had an issue with one of those, and then others worked out well. But I always felt uncomfortable in that role as mayor at the time, kind of making that decision, and it was a strange format bringing that to the council. I know the then Vice Mayor Lowing felt the same way, kind of the awkwardness of that. So I'm sure he'd likely be very happy not having to deal with it in that way, and our future mayors as well. So I think the funding availability, now understanding that, I'm comfortable moving forward with the staff recommendation on this piece.
I don't have any additional comment. I think the funding is reasonable in the breakdown. Seems reasonable as well, and something we can always fine tune, presumably, as we actually get requests.
Yeah, I think that would be the budget process, but Yeah, so I just want to make sure I'm tracking. So the 235, which was the city events and programming line item, city events and programming is now going to come to us separately from some other bucket of money. But it looks like you might want to say something about that before I go on. Please no. Okay, and then there's this bucket of money that's going to go for the nonprofit process that we're discussing for phase one tonight. And then the $50,000 are these community member planned but community-wide events. And so what I'm wondering is, where's the Know Your Neighbors small events?
So just to confirm the math here, the 235 actually is the sum of the 50 and the 185.
Right.
So what had been, or what was budgeted this past year for city events and programs will now be implemented in 50,000 for these grants similar to Know Your Neighbors. We have to come up with a new name for it. This is larger community events up to $5,000. And the 185 is the totality of what we would be using for this phase one approach. The Know Your Neighbors grants itself is actually a separate line item altogether. I think it's 50,000, is that correct? Yeah, that's correct. Okay, it is a different line item, 50,000. I think it's $1,000 limit per grant. And thank you, Director O'Kane can confirm that. That's a part of the, I believe, the CSD operating budget now.
It is. It's an ongoing budget line in the Community Service Department operating budget. It is 50,000, and yes, it's up to $1,000 for one type of grant, and I believe there's another number for a different type of grant, depending if it's your block or your neighborhood. So yes, that already exists.
So there's smaller dollar Know Your Neighbors grants up to a total of 50,000 we're allocating. Then there's another 50,000 we're allocating here, which is up to the 5,000 for citywide community planned events. And then there's that second 50 plus the 185 to get us up to the 235. That 185 is what we're talking about here for these nonprofit grants.
Any other proposals?
Proposals. Yes. But that's separate from what you're bringing to council in a couple of weeks. That's what I'm trying to understand.
That is correct.
Okay.
Because that last piece is the city produced events, which again are CSD operating budget events.
Okay.
Mayfair and the like.
CSD city events are coming. These are community programs and partners that we would be supporting with the 185 plus the 50 for the citywide, plus the 50 that's not here for the Know Your Neighbors. I think I've got it. Thank you. That's helpful to understand. And I this whole thing is somewhat of an experiment this year with the budget and the finance committee. So I think it's a good place to start, and we'll see how it goes and how it meets the needs. So that's great. So why don't we move on then to the eligibility and criteria. There was a slide 12, that had quite a list of the public benefits, and I don't know if either of my colleagues have questions. There it is, about this particular slide and these criteria. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I think I actually have a question about the eligibility point, and this is really a novice question. I think in the packet and also in the presentation, we verbally discussed that only 501c3 organizations would be eligible here. I'm assuming that's been the consistent past practice and that we haven't had much interest from non-501c3s to actually apply for these grants. Is that right?
You know, staff may want to comment on this. It has been generally the case. We have occasionally, I know, had discussions with organizations that were not 501c3s, but I believe those would be very exceptional as opposed to in any way the norm. Perhaps let me ask Minka van der Swat to confirm.
So I can only speak for HISRAP. So HISRAP
You are just, you're not required to be a 501c3, just a human services organization. I will say that in my 15 years of HISRAP history, only one time did a for-profit apply for money and they asked for the entire amount, so it wasn't even a legitimate ask. So it is primarily 501c3s that receive HISRAP funding.
Okay. Thank you. I suppose my concern would be that there might be groups like a school club or, I mean, I have no idea how the pickleball club is organized, for example, if that's an actual registered group that might want to host events and might want some budget. So my perspective is that for the early stages, while we're figuring out what this process should be, we should just open it up and see if people actually apply and are interested before we restrict it too narrowly at the very beginning. I'd welcome any thoughts or comments about that, but that's my initial thought.
I'll give you a perspective on that, and certainly the council's discretion as to where to draw that line. I think our recommendation comes from an understanding that there's something of a maturation of organizations, and when dealing with a government grant, that having the level of maturation that reflects, as would be the case in a 501c3, a board of directors and some structure to how expenditures are tracked, and then quite frankly, a level of accountability associated with that would be why we recommend to limit it to 501c3s, especially while we are piloting the process overall. If we were to open it up to, again, in more informal groups, then I think that their organizational stability could become an issue in their ability to perform the expected or to get the expected outcomes, more so than we would find with more organized groups.
Thank you. And I totally understand that those trade-offs make sense. Yeah, thank you.
Now, I definitely second staff's preference for the 501c3. We're definitely not going to find, I think, a shortage of interest in these grants. So regarding the potential criteria for allocating the community grants, I thought aligning with the council priority makes sense to some extent, but I'm concerned that if we exclusively rely on council priorities, we're really gonna miss some of the most underserved and kind of more kind of visible communities that a lot of these grants are intended to be able to help. I think council priorities are really good at capturing broad priorities for a given year, and some of the most pressing issues that are going to impact the greatest amount of people. But some of the most important work that our community grants do is really kind of help lift up those who may not quite be as visible to the council or to the community. And so I think really important to make sure that those groups are especially cared for. And I think that's what our nonprofits do so well in this community, that they're able to identify those people and those needs, and then advocate for it at the council level and at the staff level. So I think the priorities is good to consider. I would not want that to be kind of the exclusive framework in which we make these decisions. On the other criteria, I thought they were helpful and really important. I mean, the ones that I've found to be the most, that I thought we should really weigh the most, is the community reach, and making sure that we're serving Palo Altans. And of course, most of these nonprofits don't exclusively serve Palo Alto, but we already have a good process through HISRAP and CDBG, and a really just strong model there to be able to do this. The equity impact, key. I thought the service delivery and the nonprofit's ability to be able to show that they can actually deliver on these programs or services. And then on the new or existing grantee, I think we should really be prioritizing those who are both currently receiving funds from the city and who rely on city funding to be able to leverage other funding sources. I know when I was on the HRC, I think I served every time on the His Wrap and the CDBG subcommittees, and that was something that we often looked for, and it was a helpful tool to be able to show that a nonprofit wasn't solely relying on city funding, that really they were using us as a way to be able to leverage additional funds, and was always impressed to see how much just a little bit of money from the city of Palo Alto really helped them with private donors as well as other type of organizations. So I think there are ways that we can get the most out of this. So those are important. And yeah, I think that's what I've got on eligibility criteria. Let me see if I missed anything. One question I'm curious, are there plans for the HRC to kind of weigh in on this? I mean, I'm glad that we have Ms. Vanderswag and her expertise to be able to kind of, having seen the His Wrap and the CDBG cycle, but this, I think the city has been doing this very well for a long time through His Wrap, through CDBG, and I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel in how we do this. I know it's different, so there's going to need to be some different ways in which we go about this, but.
Again, I think we look to the committee's thoughts on how best to, whether it's include the HRC as a part of the decision-making, either upfront on this whole overall process we're describing, or in how it's implemented. Again, certainly would follow your lead. We would, or we did include the schedule as one consideration, recognizing that we are already, I think, proposing a pretty aggressive timeline in order to fit within the upcoming budget cycle. It's just a consideration.
Yeah, and I'll hold off on some of those thoughts, and I guess I think the third one, the application evaluation process, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, dear colleague, for letting me parse our comments into these different categories. I will have some of the same questions. Yeah, I'll add my vote for sticking with 501c3s. As the CEO of one, I can say that you don't have to be enormous to be one, but it does enforce a certain discipline and accountability. So I think that that's something that we, at least in these early days, should stick with. Also agree with aligning it generally with our council priorities, and appreciate the best practices that you've added to the criteria. They generally make sense to me. Just a couple of thoughts about it. Yeah, the newer existing organization issue is a tricky one, really tough, because you have partners that have been there year in, year out, provided all kinds of wonderful, meaningful services to our residents, and rely to some degree on expectations of city funding. But that can have the appearance, even if not the actuality, of a clubbiness, that there's certain groups, certain fundees that, have it every year, where there's others that have equally inspiring and impactful services that just kind of can't get in. So I think that's going to be I don't have a magic answer to that, but I think that staff lifting that up to recognize that we need to at least be open to both sets of circumstances is something really important to be aware of and monitor as we go forward. Then I wanted to ask about the last criterion, which I agree with, but it's a funding and service alignment with other jurisdictions. The question is the program more aligned with services provided by the county or state? And I'm wondering how we might, in actuality, know that, if whoever is, doing the decision-making can become aware of that. Where will that screen occur?
Yeah, I think that like the example that comes to mind, for example, are some of the health services, for example, that the county typically provides. And so if we would have a request where a nonprofit would ask for services, or excuse me, for funding for those types of services during the initial screening that staff would do and prepare this packet, we could identify that and flag with a note to council of this potential being better served at that level.
Yeah, thank you. And whereas that might be the case, I could imagine there might be somewhere the county could provide it, but it's more efficiently or provided in a more tailored way locally. I suppose all of that would have to be balanced in a case-by-case basis. Okay, well, I mean, with that, though, I think you've put together a thoughtful list of best practices. And my next questions also sort of lop over into the process for all of this, because we are up against a time crunch this first time through, and it is a little experimental. And I do have some questions about that, but you have also put forth two options. So it sounds like you'd like our feedback generally on the process, but also this timing, the two ways, one of which would coincide to basically end with the budget process, and the other would give nonprofits another, 50 days to get applications in. So the money would come a little later, but they wouldn't be squished. Do I have that roughly right?
Yes, that's correct. And just to report back, yesterday we did have a listening session with our nonprofits where one of the things we heard from them was the timing of when this money would be available. There was one nonprofit that said that, they received funding during the budget, the budget process. However, those funds weren't available until much later. So the timing for them to access those funds were important.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, since my colleague, Councilmember Stone, is putting up with my organizational here, I'll turn to you first on this one. I think you had some comments on it last time.
Yeah, just on the timing piece.
Yes.
I think preferably it would be done for the budget cycle, but I also think that seems, not that I don't trust everybody in this room, but that seems very ambitious for all of us. So I guess both are incredibly ambitious. The only difference, right, is the difference in how long the application, how long the notice of funding availability is.
Yeah, I think they said 39 versus 90 days, and then you have a bottom line date that's different. Is that basically right?
I think for this year, because this is such a new, since this is so new, and I think a lot of this is going to end up being word of mouth for the various nonprofits to learn about this. I think for this year, option 2 makes sense to give those nonprofits enough time to start learning about it and then to be able to spread the word. I found they're really good at kind of taking care of their own in that way. But I think moving forward, as this becomes really kind of our normal procedure, I think we should aim for option 1. And I guess, and sorry, and then one just kind of question on the timeline. I know, like, city manager, you mentioned kind of concern about HRC's involvement and just other groups involving because of this timeline. Is that concern also just for this year getting this started, but
Yes.
not for the future?
Certainly not. It's just really trying to conform within the calendar that we've laid for you.
Yeah. So I think for this year, option 2 is the best, and future years, option 1.
Any other process questions or thoughts?
Now on just
the evaluation process. That's what
application evaluation process. Okay, sorry. Yes, I do. So I guess my question really is, I'm curious why staff proposes that the full council should review proposals and award grants directly. And I now understand if that recommendation is really just kind of tied to this year because of this timeline and not necessarily moving forward. So if it's just this year, I think that makes sense. Moving forward, I mean, I do think these decisions are really challenging, and the reasons for these grant requests are highly nuanced and really can't be neatly summed up in a 2 to 3 minute public comment period by the applicant. As I said, when I was on the HRC, and I know they continue to do this, there are subcommittees that are dedicated to examining his RAP requests and CDBG requests, and they put in a lot of time and then forward the recommendation to the full body. And typically the full body gives great deference, and then that gets forwarded to us on the city council, and we generally give great deference. And so I think moving forward after this year, I think a similar process makes sense. I'm also, interested in, do we think the expertise of this is really on the Human Relations Commission? And if they already do his RAP and CDBG, I see how this is different. How different is it really? Should we have HRC provide that recommendation like they do with his RAP and CDBG and have that come back to the full council then for our final decision? But I don't think it going to the full council kind of first makes a lot of sense to me. I think either HRC or one of our subcommittees or creating a separate subcommittee that will just review these requests makes the most sense.
Thank you. Do you have something on this one?
Yeah, I'll have a few comments here. I guess I just have also novice thought. I think the HRC's his RAP grants have generally focused on health, equity, other kinds of services, whereas some of the grants we get here might be things like Third Thursday or arts programs or things that will be hard to weigh and will ultimately be a subjective council decision. And so if it's more efficient for this cycle, I think it's fine if the council just weighs in there. I think one lesson or one thought coming, especially from the PTC appointments yesterday, is to make sure that we have a clear process so that if we are reviewing a bunch of applications, getting public comment, and then making a vote, that we have some mechanism, whether it's some sort of ranked choice voting or some sort of subcommittee or something that can just make the voting process smoother. I think that's really important because theoretically there could be gamemanship if, depending on how we actually vote, or coordinate or not coordinate and things like that. On the time frame, I had one question. So between options 1 and 2, there's a difference for council approval to proceed with the first phase 1. In option 1, it's March 24th. In option 2, it's April 14th. So around 3 weeks apart. What's envisioned to happen differently in option 1 versus 2 for those 3 weeks?
It just allows staff a little bit longer to prepare and turn around those materials.
Okay. I think that's reasonable. And I think in option 2, ultimately, the fact that we have a 90-day notice is great. I'm curious about the listening session that you alluded to yesterday from the nonprofits. Did any of them express, or did any of them look at these options or express preferences or comments on these?
Yes, they did get an opportunity to see this presentation, a little different iteration. But in terms of the options, the only response or feedback that I got was the preference for the earlier time frame versus later.
Yeah. I can see how there's maybe some programs or events or services that you would want to deliver in the summer and how option 2 makes that difficult. I mean, historically, has that been an issue? Have people, if we go with option 2, would we potentially actually miss out on applications that would otherwise want to do something more quickly?
Yeah, I'm not sure about like the timing about those months in particular in terms of influx of applications or events happening. But I will also add a little bit more background to the one comment that we did receive about the funding not having received in a timely manner was, again, we didn't have a process in place to kind of manage these one-off requests. So through this process that we are moving forward with, we can try to guarantee a more timely dissemination of those funds.
If I, sorry, Councilmember. I just wanted to make one clarification. It just dawned on me, looking at our timeline for option 1, to your discussion of the full council versus whether it's a commission or, quite frankly, option 1 basically would run parallel to or be a part of your budget decisions. And inherently, that involves the finance committee making a recommendation before the full council. So where it says council approval of funding awards, I think that's actually more likely to be the finance committee recommendations, such that those funding awards would be a part of your overall budget approval. Does that make sense? It's similar to what happened last year, or in effect, the finance committee makes the first recommendations of all budgetary decisions, excuse me, and then ultimately the city council will review and either agree or change those recommendations. But again, inherently, because this tracks with your budget approval timeline, the finance committee will have the opportunity to make recommendations on the actual nonprofit awards.
Thank you. Yeah, those were my questions for now. And I'll think a little bit more about preferences. I think ultimately either option is viable. I think aligning with budgeting is definitely appealing. But I'm also a little bit concerned that those budgeting meetings will be so overloaded that we won't be able to seriously discuss and think about the merits of the nonprofits we would vote for.
Thank you, Councilmember Liu. Yeah, this is the conversation I'd like to zero in on because the staff report got me thinking, and specifically this point. So it says, when it talks about the evaluation process, it says this could range from full city council review, as we've mentioned, and selection of proposals, to finance committee evaluation, to establish of an advisory body to develop recommendations. And what I'm wondering is there another option where the finance committee says there's X dollars for this, but does not take on, in addition to, as you rightly point out, quite a heavy burden of budgeting all the other pieces of what we do in this city. And I'm not eager to take this, on a lot more either, but this is the Policy and Services Committee, and it seems like we have a closer relationship in many ways with our nonprofit partners, and it may be, I honestly, I think ideally there would be a committee, as Councilmember Stone described, that could delve into this and figure it out, but I'm just a little reluctant this early on in this new process to recommend creating one. But I wonder if it could be, if P&S could be a place where that is done. And then I also wonder, this may not be doable, this is a question for staff, if the recommendations were to come out of this committee unanimously, is it something that could be placed on consent, or would it need a council discussion necessarily?
I think all options are open and ultimately for the council to decide. So as you just described, if the council were to agree to the dollar amount, then the P&S committee could be charged with evaluating the applications to determine who's funded, or which organization would be funded within that dollar amount. And that could run in parallel and simply plugged in parallel with the finance committee's discussion of the rest of the budget, and all plugged in at the time that the approval is brought forward.
Okay. My colleagues may not be so thrilled that I suggested that, but I think something interesting. I know we're going to talk about this again. Do you want to comment just on that point before I go on?
Yeah, I think that is what you just described is more aligned with option 2. And if maybe there's some version of option 2 where we can tighten up the timelines, like give 60 days of notice or move the April 14th date a little bit earlier, maybe we could have the best of both worlds of option 2 and option 1, and actually have a separate council meeting that we could have both policy and services input and a separate council meeting that approves the funding awards before whenever we recess for summer, or at some point earlier mid-summer.
So I don't know if you're saying that because you think we need to have the dollar amount locked in before we start, because I'm not sure if, I mean.
Oh, I thought that was what you suggested, that we carve out a dollar amount and then we.
I am. I'm just wondering how locked, how.
Yeah.
Well, here, let me. It looks like the city manager might have a thought on.
Actually, nothing to add. I think you're on point. It's a question of and quite frankly, when staff brings forward a recommendation, a recommended budget in late April, we'll set our recommended level. So let's say it is this $285,000. At that initial review, the council as a whole could tell us, keep going on that path, or if you think we should adjust it upwards or downwards as the finance committee does its work. And again, in this kind of scenario we're talking about, that the P&S committee could be assigned to work on this specific decision.
So that would mean that under option 1, council could approve the dollar amount on March 24th, and then we could look at the actual applications under either option, and the finance committee is doing its work in parallel.
Yes, I mean, and again, your call, but it could be a fixed dollar amount, or basically this is the ballpark you're working with the final decision left as a part of the actual budget adoption.
I see. Let me just make one point and then I'll go right to you. Because I actually, so a lot of the, the nonprofit partners we deal with are tremendous and sophisticated, but they're not always entities that can withstand, waiting for some dollars. Many of them are smaller. And so I tend toward option 1 just to kind of honor that. And I know you didn't get a lot of feedback, but you got some along that line. And so if there were a way we could make option 1 work, I would tend toward that, because honestly, yes, the longer application period's nice, but we all kind of scramble toward the end of the grant deadline. I mean, that's just kind of the reality. So as long as it's long enough and then they get the dollars earlier, I would tend toward that. But let me turn to Councilmember Stone. I think he has some additional thoughts.
I think it's fine P&S vetting the applications and being able to make recommendations based on the city manager's budget proposal. I mean, there's 3 members of this body, and if we are working on a certain budget, we only need 4 votes at the to actually approve the budget. So I think we would have that would be a strong, I think, indication to finance and the rest of the council of kind of where we're at on this piece. So I would be surprised if the proposed budget from the city manager would then change all that dramatically. I think politically that would be unlikely. And if it does, right, we could always make a recommendation of a dollar amount and then break that just down proportionally and say, okay, if it's reduced by 50,000 by the council, then it's a proportional reduction. So I think we would be smart enough to be able to handle it, even if we don't have the final dollar amount at that time. So I'm not too worried. So I still think a longer time frame for the nonprofits is desirable, but maybe it's something in between option one and option two.
Perhaps if, this is intended to be agendized next month as well, is that right? Perhaps we could, at this moment, make sort of a public call for public comment and input on the option one versus option two timeline. I'd welcome public comment next time. I'd welcome emails in the interim, welcome, communications to staff to kind of let us know, what the feeling is out in the community on that item. Let's move on to the last of the four categories, which is monitoring and reporting. And here's where we have broken the applicants into the applications into the small, medium, and large grants category. I have a thought or two about this, but let me first turn and see if either of my colleagues would like to make any comments on this. Well, why don't I just start? And I think my only comment is that the small grants of less than 5,000 feels really small to me. And the reason I say that is when you jump up to the medium grants, all of a sudden you have semi-annual reporting, more financial. It feels to me like it should be more like 10 or 20 before you do that, because you can burn through 10 grand pretty fast on an event. Without having a lot of bells and whistles. So I would say that it should go up to at least 10, if not $20,000 as the break point, because even at 20, that's a long way from $100,000, which is the top of the medium category. So that would be my instinct. But I think I do like the escalating and de-escalating demands, because I do think for little folks, they just can't answer a multi-page questionnaire, and it's kind of meaningless when you only have a handful of volunteers running a nonprofit. So I do appreciate the time you took to split them into those three categories. Councilmember Lee, do you have comments? No. Councilmember Stone.
Just to second what you said as far as that range, I thought that too was too big, too broad of a range for the medium grants.
Staff, do you have any thoughts on if you were willing to raise that break point?
No concerns.
Okay. Any other comments? I'm getting a thumbs up from my right. Okay, so what else do you need from us for tonight? That cover the?
Yeah, I think this gives us great feedback to then firm this up, bring this back next month, and in particular that feedback, if we hear any on preference for option one or two from our community and nonprofit partners.
Councilmember Liu.
Just to confirm, if we did not give a hard steer on option one or option two, and if when we come back next month, we can, the expectation is that then we will make the hard steer. Okay. Yeah, I just want to triple check. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Alamos, City Manager. Appreciate that. I think this is an important item to get into better shape. So thank you. All right. So now back to the future. We're going to go back to action item 2 and welcome back our city auditor. This is the presentation of the utility billing audit report and recommendation. Welcome back, city auditor.
Thank you very much. Again, Kate Murdoch, City Auditor. The utility billing audit was on the FY24 annual audit plan, and I'll be presenting the results. I want to take this opportunity to thank the city's utility and public works departments for their assistance in conducting this audit. Next slide, please. The objectives of this audit were to determine whether the utility billing internal controls are adequate and working effectively to ensure that billing is accurate and in compliance with city policies and procedures, and whether billing adjustments are properly supported and approved. Next slide, please. The City of Palo Alto Utilities provides 5 utility services, which include electricity, natural gas, water, wastewater, and fiber optics. The Utility Billing Division also bills for services provided by the Public Works Department, including recycling, compost, garbage, wastewater, and stormwater management services. The majority of the city's customer accounts are residential, and in fiscal year 2023, there were approximately 30,000 electric accounts. We also wanted to note that the utility is making improvements to the billing process with the advanced metering infrastructure project, and as of mid-January, approximately 80% of the meters have been installed. The city anticipates that these smart meters will help residents to more efficiently use energy and water resources and enable customers to more easily adopt solar energy and energy storage solutions. Next slide, please.
Yay.
Our first finding was overall a positive result. We found that utility bills and adjustments are accurately calculated and in compliance with city policies. We did find some areas for improvement. Some billing adjustments and account write-offs were not properly documented or approved. Adjustments are initiated from various sources, such as utility billing exception reports when values fall outside of normal ranges and when a customer disputes the amount of a bill. Write-offs occur when accounts are past due and collection processes have been exhausted. Ensuring adjustments and write-offs are properly accounted for and approved helps to protect the city against potential financial losses and/or fraud. As you can see on the slide, we tested 60 adjustments and found 10 were lacking proper documentation and/or approval. Out of 25 write-offs that were tested, we noted that 4 were not properly approved. We did want to note that with the implementation of the smart meters, it's likely that the number of billing adjustments will decrease. Next slide, please. We recommend the city review the adjustments process and determine if there are ways to automate approvals, ensure that policies and procedures related to adjustments include all necessary steps, develop process checks for both processors and reviewers of adjustments, and provide regular training on these procedures, as well as any changes or updates. Finally, we recommend that the city continue its practice of incorporating stale dated check support in the quarterly memo and ensure staff receive training on this as well. Management agreed with this finding and recommendation. Next slide, please. Our second finding is related to internal control gaps that we identified in the utility billing process, and we recommend that these be addressed to prevent potential errors and inefficiencies. We noted that the utility does not currently instruct staff on the proper segregation of duties related to consumption adjustments. Segregation of duties is to ensure that the same person processing the adjustment is not the same person approving the adjustment. The lack of segregation of duties can result in inadequate review and increased risk of potential errors and/or fraud. We also noted that the department does not have a formal documented process for regularly reviewing outstanding investigations to ensure that prompt resolution of billing adjustments happens. Next slide, please. We recommend the city consider implementing a control to ensure proper segregation of duties between processing and approving adjustments, and a regular periodic review of outstanding billing adjustments to prevent prolonged unresolved billing issues. Management agreed with this finding and recommendation. Next slide, please. In reviewing the utility billing process, the audit team made 2 additional observations. First, we noted that creating a list of approved adjustment reasons or codes for use with the adjustments log could improve efficiency, as current notes in the log can vary for the same item, making it difficult to immediately identify the issue. Second, we noted that while the utility monitors some key performance indicators, these indicators are not formally tracked, and there are additional indicators that may help the department manage its performance and identify areas for improvement. This concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Murdoch. Does staff have anything before we turn to, yes, welcome, Mr. Yuan, is it?
My name is Tom Auzen.
Oh, Tom, thank you. I had the wrong.
I'm the Assistant Director for Utility Customer Support.
Well, thank you. Welcome. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
Thank you. No, we basically agree with the findings. We process $350 million in billings a year. We process 90,000 meter readings a month. We do a lot of transactions. And as we move from a transactional business model to more of an advisory business model, with recommendations for how people can control their utility bills, as well as just the transactional aspect of it. There's always room for improvement. And so we take these seriously, and we will implement these recommendations. Actually, we're already in the process of implementing these recommendations. It's nice to know that Baker Tilly took their work so well, and it was actually a pleasure working with them.
Excellent. Well, it's nice for us up here to hear the compliments from them about working with you and the compliments from you about working with Baker Tilly. So that's good news. We want to see a robust and thorough, and in this case, pretty positive audit. So appreciate the cooperation of all parties. Before I turn to my colleagues, is there any public comment?
There are no requests to speak.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'll bring it back to the dais. Councilmember Lee.
Yeah, I'll ask some novice council member questions again. Just as a matter of framing, what was the impetus and origin to audit this specific issue?
That's a great question. So the audit plan is developed every year that we do a citywide risk assessment, and some years that risk assessment process is more involved and in-depth than others. So this audit actually came up prior to my term, and so it was identified, I think, through. So we look at everything from the budget to the amount of scrutiny that function gets from the public. So we have several criterion factors where we look at different programs, departments, functions in the city. And then do a ranking. And then we also take any comments that we may receive about concerns or questions as to how that area is functioning. So I believe that my predecessor may have had some, questions about how adjustments were being handled or things of that nature. And so I think that was part of what led her to put this on the plan.
So there aren't specific incidences of fraud or a particular spike in customer complaints or anything that we're meaning to address here. It's difficult to trace this to specific issues.
That is correct. There was nothing specific that prompted this audit.
Mm-hmm. And I know this may not be the core focus of this audit, but were there any learnings or analysis about the correctness of the metering or the frequency of the adjustments and how that might have changed over time, things like that? We periodically get email complaints about how, people need their bills adjusted after some metering change or just after some other random change, which are often misdirected, but I just want to understand the context and if we looked into those kinds of issues at all.
Sure. I mean, we did review some of those issues as we did look at the adjustment process, what prompts an adjustment. We did not do a larger scale kind of trend analysis on that, as it was really outside the scope of this audit. This audit was really focused on if billing was accurate. So we did a lot of testing around, how the bills were calculated and if those calculations were in line with city policy. And we're really pleased to see that everything, was checking out, that adjustments were being handled well. So.
Thank you. One last question. So there are, under additional observations, the second bullet about a number of metrics that we could track over time. I don't think, or maybe I missed it, if there was a staff response to those metrics and if we have any plan to track them and report changes in them in the future.
We have had internal discussions about those metrics. Some we already track. Some we would have to create. We would have to monitor them on a manual basis because the systems can't work through it. But yeah, it can be incorporated into some of the reporting to the UAC on a regular basis.
I think these are, at least some of them, pretty core metrics like first contact resolution rate, overall customer satisfaction, and potentially the UAC will also have interest and scope for some of the more financial metrics. I think those are worth regularly reporting to the UAC.
The customer satisfaction metric is done in a number of places in the city, and utilities is rolled into that.
Okay. Those were my questions. I really appreciate your work, Director Ozan. Did I get that right? Okay, and Ms. Murdoch, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Ozan, $350 million per year of processing, that's terrific. And I mean, we're really proud here that we own our own utilities, all of them, with the only city that does. And it's, I would guess it differs a bit, billing practices from one to the other, the utilities. I don't mean so much our internal practices, it's just plain doing it, the mechanics of doing it. And so to me, it's just terrific that when the first line on the slide is utility bills and adjustments are accurately calculated in compliance with city policies. I'm proud of that. I'm sure you're proud of that. And I want to thank the whole utilities department for having such a good audit result. But I also really appreciated what you said about this being, yes, there's this whole transactional piece, but also this advisory piece that we now do through billing in the utility department. To achieve the goals, our climate goals here in the city that are ambitious, but we're also proud of those, is going to take a real partnership with our residents. And you all are that link, you know, very much part of that link in terms of communicating with them and providing services. So I appreciate that you see that as part of the work. I do have just one question. Perhaps I'm missing something a little bit, but for one of the audit recommendations, it was that this is for the second one, for finding 2, the internal control gaps, talking about segregating duties between processing and approving adjustments. And yet, for finding 1, there was a recommendation that we automate approvals to minimize human error. So if we are automating, aren't we kind of naturally segregating them away from the person? What am I missing here?
I'm not entirely sure I understand, but you know, I think the second finding or recommendation about the consumption adjustments was specific to those types of adjustments that are being done.
Maybe Mr. Azen could take he looked like he had a response.
Yeah, and I think it also probably is related to approval authorities. So we try to ensure that the same person preparing the document is not the same person approving the document, just for a variety of quality assurance and quality control methodologies. Because we have different levels of signing authority, it's using an instrument like DocuSign. It's more of a manual process. Okay, we could actually probably try and find a way to automate that a little bit more so that it automatically goes to the next level, wherever it should be. But usually we find that we're catching those. Whoever is the last in the approving list will say, well, wait a minute, I can't approve this. It's got to go one more. So it's a tweak more than a needed automation, I think.
Okay. Because it's always a good practice to segregate those processes and approvals. It seemed to me that it looked like, I think it was in conjunction with some of the AMIs and meter implementation and things, that it was looking at an automation that would avoid some human approvals, was the sense I got. And I thought that, sort of inherently segregates if you have a machine doing at least certain levels. And that was my point of confusion.
Well, there is one function, and Kate can speak to this as well. It's called implausibles. When a utility bill is out of range of its historical precedents, it gets spit out, either by consumption or by cost. And what we're finding, or what we're hoping, is that with AMI and the ability of the individual customer to work out their own utility budgets, essentially, that a lot of our implausible verifications will wind up going away. So, I mean, I think that's what you're speaking of.
I think so. Thank you. So appreciate the city's agreement with the recommendations and the efforts there. I also appreciate Councilmember Liu's suggestions on the additional observations. I want to thank the utilities team for staying late with us. And I think I need a motion to recommend to the council that they accept this audit. I have a motion.
So move.
A second.
Councilmember Vinker?
Did you say? Pardon me?
I apologize. I thought we were ready for the vote.
Okay. Yes, I just wanted to make sure that we had a second. So yes.
Councilmember Stone?
Yes.
Councilmember Liu?
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right. Thank you. Okay. And thank you so much for being here with us tonight. All right, so we'll move to our last action item, item 4, which is follow-up from 2025 council retreat, discussion on 2025 umbrella operating strategies, guiding council priorities. Turn it over to Deputy City Manager Cotton Gaines.
Thank you. Give me just 1 second, thanks. Good evening. Just making sure I put up the report. Chantel Cotton Gaines, Deputy City Manager. The item before you today is a follow-up from your City Council retreat. This is something that was discussed at the retreat. It's related to the idea of establishing some umbrella operating strategies. In addition to your existing city council values and your priorities, and then the priority objectives. So this is intended to be in partnership with that is the discussion that happened at your city council retreat. In the staff report, we sort of summed up some of the discussion that we heard at the retreat and also shared where some of these proposed operating strategies are potentially already reflected in your existing value statement or the city budget. But that is for discussion of this committee of if these existing values are actually capturing it in the way that you are intending, or if there is further interest in exploring the umbrella strategies in some sort of way. So just to orient the committee, on packet page 63, we included a table with the proposed umbrella operating strategies on the left side, and then some of the related council actions that are already in place on the right side of that table. And we can answer any questions that you may have for staff. I think the intention of the council at the retreat is for the committee to discuss it and see if this is something you want to move forward, and if so, how. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Madam Clerk, do we have any public comment on this?
We do not have any requests to speak. We have one request to speak on Zoom. One moment, please.
Thank you.
Our first public speaker is Jennifer L.
Hello again, Council. So it's been really confusing for, I'm not going to call myself an average, let's say involved resident, because I've been involved with the airplane noise issue for several years. So I have a sort of system of trying to keep track of this issue. And it's gotten very convoluted in trying to engage with the city. It's something that the community at large put on the public agenda, but we have a very hard time getting updates from the city, having things put on the agenda. And what I noticed is that other residents have similar issues about engaging with council. And so in the operating principles, there's something about public input and response to the public. And on other topics, I hear that you have these listening sessions with stakeholders. And I just wonder if you've done that with residents. Like, have you asked us about how it's going in terms of engaging with council and seeing sort of our advocacy reflected? Maybe some groups that you're closer to, feel comfortable, but for the people that have not been able to get much attention on something, some people have to put up petitions, and that's a lot of work. And so I'm just wondering if there's a way to improve public engagement and where that fits, because I've been trying to follow the meetings and it's very confusing, and why I think after you've resolved everything, it'll be really great if you can convey to the public, look, this is how we think you can more effectively bring issues to the table, before they become a big deal. With airplane noise, the idea has always been that, there's nothing going on and that the city can't do anything about it. And then what specifically can the city do about certain things? And it needs a review, because you're working on certain things that, well, first of all, we don't know what you're working on. And then on the other hand, you're not working on things that the public put on the public agenda, such as nighttime aircraft noise, et cetera, and you've not followed up on things that people worked really hard to put on the table. So anyways, I guess this is a broader comment, but I think that there hasn't been enough listening to residents as to how the process works for us. Thanks.
Thank you. And does that conclude public comment?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. Okay, so let me bring it back to the dais and see if my colleagues have thoughts and comments coming out of our retreat on the proposed operating strategies. Councilmember Liu.
Has the mayor provided any more clarity to the vice mayor or to staff about how the mayor thinks about these operating strategies, or if there are any thoughts or updates in general from his end?
We have not received anything additional beyond the retreat discussion.
I have heard from him on one point of the four that I can comment on in a moment, but I haven't received additional comment on sort of how we would deploy these, if that's what you're asking.
Just in general, we had a bunch of discussions on all of these, whether he wants to modify or pull any of them, whether he still wants to keep the operating umbrella strategies framework. But yeah, just whatever updates I'd be curious to hear. I'm just conscious that this is a very mayor-driven exercise, and we want to respect that. So yeah, any updates would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, all I can add is that it is a mayor-driven suggestion here. And he knows that we're going to be looking tonight at additions, deletions, approval, or rejection. So he, I think, wants to know, while he proposes this, is this something that we think is helpful as we go through our work and for the year? Councilmember Stone.
Yeah, a few questions for staff. I think the operating strategies seem like they'd be used by both council and staff to further refine how we achieve our city priorities each year. I mean, that's kind of how I interpret it. So I'm just wondering if staff can talk to how you'd use these strategies in accomplishing our annual priorities.
I believe that the intended framework was to help the council in framing and developing those priorities. It wasn't my interpretation that they would support staff in that work, but certainly through understanding what those priorities would be, staff would be supportive of that process.
Okay. And then I'm curious how, I mean, and I don't think anyone here probably has this question, but how we would balance some of these. I found like the first and second bullet points to be like reducing employee vacancy rates and taking a more cautious approach to budgeting decisions. Those kind of seem a bit contradicting to me. I don't know if other people kind of felt the same way. And then I kind of felt like most of this is already being done under the set of values that council passed a few years ago. So staff or colleagues see this as redundant, or does this provide any additional value in how we do or how you prioritize the work?
I didn't want to jump in front of the chair if there was interest. I think in our review of the umbrella strategies, we really tried to see where it was linked to other things that we already have direction from the city council on. And so, for example, with the reducing the employee vacancy rate, that's something that we know that the council has as part of the performance metrics for the city manager. And that's something we report out regularly to the council on. And as an example, for the budgeting decisions, in one of your council values is really focused on our fiscal sustainability. And so we think that that one is covered in some existing direction that you've given us. The same for the increasing effectiveness and channels of communication, really safeguarding public trust through transparent processes. If there are other ideas that you have in mind on that one, obviously that one can be really robust. We're open to that. And the last one of structuring committees for optimum effectiveness, I think that was a topic at the retreat, and with the action related to what committees you'll continue, et cetera, which is a discussion the council's had. So I wouldn't say that they aren't bringing us extra value. I think I would describe it as really, the council's been really intentional with the direction that you've given us already. And I think that these items are aligned with some of that direction.
Yeah, and I kind of agree. I mean, one, I think we could do a better job at referencing those values when priority setting time comes around. I remember when we worked on those a few years ago, I'm concerned that this would be kind of the same type of thing, that we'd create these umbrella strategies, we put a lot of work into it, and then we'll forget about it in a couple of years and struggle to kind of reference it at the right time. So I think we could do a better job at that. I do think it would be interesting for us to be able to agendize it for future meetings, discussions about, how can we improve committee assignments? How can we work more efficiently as a council to respect those committee recommendations, et cetera? I mean, of course, the council should kind of critically look at recommendations, but I understand, like, I think a lot of other cities and organizations a lot of the work is done at the committee level, and then it kind of goes to the full body, and it's typically more of like a consent item issue. And I think we could do a better job at that as a body. And I would love to see us, again, I think this is a separate issue, but it's kind of related to this, really re-examine how we do our retreat and how beneficial that is for the council, for the community, for staff, and see are there better ways to be able to do it. I've always been of kind of mixed mind on that. I think my fifth retreat this year, I thought this one was actually pretty good. Others have not been so great, and so maybe there are better ways that we could do it. Or maybe just I don't like Saturday meetings. That could be it too. So overall, I mean, I think I like how the mayor is trying to think out of the box and trying to change some ways in which we kind of do our work. I think that's a valuable discussion, but without kind of what George was saying, I think kind of without a better understanding of what the goal is here, I really don't have too much more to add to this, and I kind of feel like we're already doing this in a lot of ways.
And I really like the idea of elevating the values a little bit more during the priority setting process. We did fold your values into your council procedures and protocols, which we also spent a ton of time doing some work on. And so I think that is something we can elevate. We share them at the retreat, but maybe there's another way that we can really pull that out, because the idea behind those values was that it is your overarching core principles that you will do regardless of what your annual priorities are. And so I think that was the intent with the creation of those, and maybe there's a way that we can elevate that and accomplish this at the same time.
Start up procedures and protocols.
Procedures and protocols will be back soon enough, don't worry.
Yeah, I very much agree with most all of what has been expressed this evening. And I think that I actually cited a couple of the values that we've passed previously in responding to the mayor at the retreat about these operating strategies. And I do appreciate him lifting up sort of what I would call almost more focus or prioritizing items in his view. But I think we need to think about how, I look at these as almost more a matter of emphasis than a matter of something different or new. It feels like we have had an operating strategy over the last couple of years to reduce employee vacancy. And I do appreciate that is a performance indicator for the city manager. So I think as an operating strategy, it's there. I do want to share that I believe there is an underlying interest with this to get more granular information in the interest of reducing employee vacancy faster, because that's how I read this, accelerating the rate of filling positions. So, for example, if there is a way that we could review vacancies by department, he's indicated to me that's an interest, so that we can see there might be one department that's doing well and another that's not, or there are things that we could support as a council in your hiring efforts to alleviate some of that. An example I was giving recently was that we were just talking about utilities a little bit ago, that the vacancy rate in utilities in Q1, well, it says Q1 of 2025 ending in September 2024, which doesn't make any sense, but was up 18% compared to 14% in the previous quarter that ended in June. So, there may be, and there will be episodic reasons for that in the various departments and things that happen. But I think tracking that to see if there's some sort of aberration that requires more resources, or so it's more intentional, is something that we can just take note of. So I don't know if there's any comment on that before I go on.
Just at the highest level of the annual budget setting process is one of the places that we bring that, but I understand if there's a question of just how often you get that information. But in the budget process, that is for sure where we're able to note some of what we've seen throughout the course of the year and what we expect in terms of resources for the upcoming fiscal year.
Yeah, I think that is the idea, is that a little more than with the annual process. And, taking a more cautious approach to budgeting decisions, I agree with Councilmember Stone that there's a little tension there between 1 and 2. But that to me is something that's certainly appropriate for the mayor to suggest and tout and support. But I think that's going to be almost council member by council member as to what degree of risk versus caution each is comfortable with as things, adjust during the year, because, we've seen a lot of movement recently, and there could be more. So I think that we do have the value there of balancing revenues. So I think just bearing that in mind as we have. Communication, the mayor certainly lifted up when he first took on the role as something that he wants to really promote and do. And I do think that is also consistent with our values. But, with respect to the public comment, there's something that I think also would be well received by our community. If we can, because what's interesting is a lot of times I'll hear suggestions from the community about ways to communicate, and I'll find out staff's already doing that. So I think somehow, sometimes there's a lack of awareness. Sometimes there are new ways of communicating that we're just sort of catching up to because we're a big institution. But I do think that is incumbent upon us to really be on top of. But lastly, structuring committees. That may be something that we want to just think a little more about, how we, how the agendas sync up with the priority objectives that are going to come. So we have our retreat and we have our big objectives, our top 4, and then you'll come back with all the specific, 70 or however many, and how that syncs with our work so that we promote those, that we know where you are on those, where there are hitches, perhaps somehow doing that to make the committee work a little more effective, honestly, toward the things that we've said we want to be effective on, would be helpful. And if part of doing that is looking at this retreat and how we make it a little more, I don't want to say useful, because I do think it is useful, but more efficiently useful, more productive. I'm all in for that. I think that's something that would help get the communication off to a good step in the beginning of the year, and could definitely help us in our policy making. So I think these are. I'm not sure we need to adopt a separate statement of operating strategies, but I do think we can take lessons from all of these. So that's sort of, so I don't feel a need to approve or reject them. I think there's something where we take note and try to embed them in the work we do. Councilmember Liu.
Thank you. I think ultimately, if this is just for council, these operating strategies are just something for us to think about. That's not going to have a lot of legs. We think about these things all the time, and we can basically deprecate this. And by, I guess, the option of like doing something, of ratifying them or not ratifying them or doing nothing, I guess the default, if we don't officially adopt them, is just that they will not go anywhere, which I think is fine. But I think I do like the intent of these operating strategies, and I think they're just to kind of make a case and air that case out. It can really only work if there's staff and in particular leadership buy-in. And would imagine that there is some flexibility within staff to kind of reframe some of the issues when they get presented to us. Like, for example, when we talk about a more cautious approach to budgeting, maybe in the staff reports, there could be more discussion about funding cliffs and budget issues. Maybe projects that have uncertain funding, like maybe Palo Alto Link, should be actively brought to the city council agenda so we can make a hard budget decision earlier on whether to stop it or keep it going, or other examples like that. Like if staff can buy into that and say, we're going to add more details about the budget trade-offs of everything, we're going to bring budget questions actively just as agenda items, then I think these operating strategies can still have legs. If we can kind of talk about similar things for communication that could be built into the presentations or staff reports. We could prioritize a new set of neighborhood town halls. We could do these mural press conferences. Like those things could all use staff support. And I think that would be the case that the mayor is making, that if we actually get some staff support or changes in staff practices to enable these, council could be more effective on these topics. So I don't want to say that was like a devil's advocate position, but I just wanted to air out the case for why we should adopt them. And I hope I'm capturing the mayor's intent correctly. One thing that I'll just say as an aside is, for structuring committees, I think policy and services should definitely see more policies and services. So I'm glad that so far this year, homelessness and mental health have been discussed as things that will go to this body for much deeper discussion.
Thank you. So let me follow up on that and see if I can just toss something out there, because the question is whether we want to make any kind of recommendation to the full council. And I wonder whether, structuring committees feels more like a kind of a task for us that we could take on. But the first three, what I'm wondering is whether we could recommend to the full council that as we make policy decisions this year, we ask ourselves, one, whether it will accelerate reducing employee vacancy, two, whether it's prudent in light of the uncertain economic, whether the financial impacts are sufficiently cautious in light of the the economic uncertainty backdrop, and three, whether or not we have effectively communicated the policy. I don't want to say the policy options and decisions to our residents, and then it's just kind of almost a self checklist that we would contemplate as we make the decisions. So in other words, I don't think we can mandate that everyone take a more cautious approach to budgeting decisions. There will be some people who feel, perhaps there's some change of economic circumstance and they don't want to. But I do think that asking ourselves those three questions inherent in the first three proposed strategies may be something council could do. I just toss that out there for thoughts from my colleagues.
I would actually be curious whether staff thinks that they can change their approach to agendizing things or including information in staff reports that kind of aligns more with the at least the first three umbrella strategies, because that would also help us do what you just suggested.
Thank you for the question. I think that we have information that hits at some of these, and maybe we can sort of pull that thread a little bit more in staff reports. There's a section that's focused on sort of fiscal impact. And I think that in every staff report, and I think that that's where we're really trying to think of those financial impacts. So as we're having those discussions, if we aren't quite in the way that you're sort of imagining in your tickler list, I think that is good to ask those questions so we can continue to improve and iterate. Similarly, there's a stakeholder engagement section in the staff reports. And the intention of that section is to really talk through who has been talked to in a process before it comes to the city council and where we've shared information. So I think that there's opportunity there if there's questions about maybe we can expand on it or you're not seeing all the engagement that staff did, that we can really beef those two parts up. We don't fully talk about vacancies in staff reports unless it's relevant to that specific topic. So that one is a little less every staff report, I think, but the other two, the intention is the existing structure is supposed to give you enough of that baseline information.
Yeah, I think maybe just still kind of hypothetically talking from the perspective of Mayor Lowing, I think maybe there are some of those subtle changes that might make sense. I mean, on vacancies, I agree. I really like that the city manager has a numerical goal. I mean, I feel like have been some points in staff reports where, for example, when the PERT program is referenced, every time someone asks a question, like, oh, that's actually unstaffed and not actually active, right? Or we have these questions all the time about traffic enforcement and it was gone, now it's back. And maybe, for example, what the mayor might be getting at is that we can have more of this context and we can kind of flag as a council what we think is critical to prioritize this vacancy. I'm just riffing. I think council, or I think, staff gets it. We can be responsive to these umbrella strategies. And I agree with your perspective, Chair Vinker, on I guess just recommending that council members pay attention to these things. I think that's fine.
Well, we could make a recommendation to council that we direct staff to, when appropriate, make a point to include in the staff reports departmental employee vacancies where relevant. You may already be doing that, but make that clear. That there be in the fiscal impact, some lifting up of risk associated with it, and that in the stakeholder engagement portion, there is a focus on the perceived effectiveness of the communication to our residents and what else, if anything, staff might recommend we do. So I think if we just, like you say, beef up those two sections, that would then cue us on council to look at those things as we go through the year. Would that be too burdensome, or is that something staff could do?
I'll need to see the motion. But while she's typing it, I did realize I'd be remiss if I don't say that. I know that the Human Resources Department does have their large sort of recruitment strategy that the council is aware of. So they are actively working on reducing our vacancies and working on that within all of the departments. I did want to say that I know the council's aware of that work and that that's in our sort of daily brain and thinking within human resources, especially with the new recruitment hiring management.
Oh, that's great. And I'm just thinking that on some items, certainly not all, it might be an opportune time to give that more granular data without having to throw out a whole lot of granular data that we don't have time to look at. And I think you were saying you already do oftentimes, but if there was a specific intention to, when relevant, report on like the quarterly employee vacancy in the relevant department or departments to that action item, that might be a way of complying with his intent. And so that's why let's see. So, right. I think that's pretty close. Because the idea was that when he says take a more cautious approach to budgeting decisions, if we do have, fiscal impact, whether there is any associated risk, I think that sort of covers that. So, yeah, I'll go ahead and make a motion for that and see whether I have a second. If not, we'll move on.
I'll second it.
Thank you. Is there any discussion on this motion? I welcome any friendly amendments.
I think it's fine. I mean, I could imagine a bunch of hypothetical amendments. I'm not totally sure if perceived effectiveness of communications is something that's easy for staff to do. I mean,
maybe because the idea was to increase effectiveness and channels of communication. So maybe it's any recommendations for additionally effective
maybe like volume of or like type and volume of community outreach. Like we usually get that for many topics, but we don't actually know, oh, you sent this many postcards and I don't know, you did all this other outreach to people who live by a creek or whatever. We always ask those questions anyways during our meetings, like who did you talk to and communicate and bring to this room? So
I'm good with that. I might just add at the end, and any recommendations for increased effectiveness of communications. So I think that's what he's getting at.
Yeah.
You may have them, you may not.
Is it easier to just say quantity of communications in the stakeholder engagement instead of the type and volume? Either way, it's fine.
I think type's important.
Yeah.
Okay.
Then
that's
quantity,
fine.
type and volume. It's
okay.
Maybe also there could be a bullet to proactively agendize issues that could reduce employee vacancies or could reduce budget burdens. Still trying to think that through, but it's like, the only example I can think of in my head is like Palo Alto Link. If we don't know what the funding strategy is and it's just in a just uncertain, like floating state, just bring those kinds of things to council and we can settle the budget impacts of things like that. I don't know if that's like the spirit of what we want to do, but bringing those budget issues to us, bringing anything that can help with vacancies to us seems good.
Yeah, I think that the budget typically would go to finance committee if they saw some issue that was that was likely to create risk of being out of range of the revenue or expense side of the budgets. I would assume that would come to finance, but I could ask staff what the practice there would be if
the practice related to which piece of it?
So if staff saw coming some change of circumstance that would have some kind of any adverse or positive revenue impact or expense impact, how would that get flagged for council?
I think that may be in your quarterly financial reports that are going to, I believe, the finance committee. So I'll double check with, there's Ms. Nelson. Thank you. I was going to flag you.
Excellent. Welcome.
Yeah. Good evening, committee. Kylie Nitze, Assistant City Manager, and a little bit hearkening from a prior rule. A couple of times the staff come to both the finance committee and council regarding budget issues. So to kind of everybody's points, the quarterly reports that go to the finance committee are perhaps maybe the best placed opportunity to provide some of those statistical updates on like where we're at fiscally, how are things looking? We also include things in that like status of workers' comp, as well as overtime usage and public safety, which are two other large kind of fiscal indicators that are going to impact things like vacancy rates. And then in terms of if we were to see something going south, um, be assured if we see something, we will say something. So that's part of our role from a fiduciary standpoint. So, you know, an example of that is in our mid-year, I fully expect that the council will have a discussion over kind of where are we at from my financial status perspective. And that's going to come to the full council at the end of this month. So there really are at minimum quarterly and likely more frequently touch points with the council on all of these topics.
Yeah, thank you. And I think when it says take a more cautious approach to budgeting decisions, we only make those budgeting decisions a couple times a year unless there's, you know, something else, you know, happening. So I think that we could even take this up with the full council if they want to add more, unless you feel strongly about.
No strong thoughts, just thinking aloud. I think this is good.
I'm good with it. Anything more there? No. Okay, I think we can take a vote.
Chair Vinker,
Yes.
Councilmember Lou,
Yes.
Councilmember Stone.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for the thoughtful discussion, and thank you, Assistant City Manager, for joining us, and thank you all staff for being here, and our Deputy City Manager has one more thing to say.
Actually, it's a question. Since that passed unanimously, it can go on consent. It sounds like that is your interest. Want to verify?
I'm fine with that, despite what I just said. So if you're fine with, I'm getting 3 nods. Consent would be fabulous.
All
Thank
right,
you.
excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Future meeting and agendas. When is our next meeting? It would be in March.
Our next meeting is March 11th, just 1 month from, or 1 month exactly from today. We will have a few audit reports that are coming to you, as well as the follow-up discussion on the nonprofits work plan. And there may be one other item I'm verifying with staff.
Excellent. Thank you. Something from my colleague, yes?
On just the start time of the meeting is 7 o'clock at the discretion of the body, or is that written into our procedures protocols?
I'm also looking to the clerk's office and the attorney's office for the official process, but typically the committees, if you would like to meet at a different time, then we can meet at whatever time you prefer. I believe we may just have to list it differently, and I'm looking to the clerk's office to explain that.
Yes, so I do believe that in practice, the chair has the discretion to change the start time if they would like. So for example, both Finance Committee and the Policy and Services Committee, the start time is listed as 7 p.m. in the Muni Code, but the Finance Committee meets at 5:30.
Understood. Okay.
So if you have a time that the committee is comfortable with meeting before 7, you can sort of by consensus make that choice today or later, and we will work with staff.
Yeah, I think 6 or 6:30. I think if we start at 7, we're always going to be getting out of here between 9 and 10. And after what I think is going to be many long council meetings, this is challenging. So I think a 6 or 6:30 start would be nice, so we can get out of here by 9. But you know, open to others.
I would say 5:30 or 6, with the preference for 5:30.
I was going to say, as long as you don't start it with a 5, because I just think that one, it's just harder getting around and getting. I mean, it's not that far, but just with things going on in the day, to wrap them up, I'm often still wrapping them up at 5:30, and so any start time before 6 is actually quite difficult. You know, council used to start around 7, and then it just kept creeping earlier. Then we pushed it back from 5 to 5:30 last year. That was a big deal. I'm afraid that sometimes when we creep earlier, we go longer because we feel like we can. And so, if both of you have a desire to go earlier, why don't we say 6? Does that work for each of you?
Yes.
And how about staff? Do you need to check and get back to us, or?
I mean, it's mostly myself and our attorney's office, so it's fine.
So long as the start times are properly reflected on the agenda, the meeting schedule and start times is up to the committee's pleasure.
Well, thank you for that. We want to make sure it doesn't cause undue disruption to your personal or professional life if we were to change. And the clerk. All right. So why don't we try next month at 6, and we will see how we do and go from there. All right. Thank you.
Yes.